They thought they had me cornered. In a locked conference room, the compliance officer slid a folder across the table. Inside, proof that I'd leaked client data. Timestamps, emails, even a digital trail that looked bulletproof. But it was too perfect, and I knew instantly this wasn't an investigation. It was an execution. Someone inside the company wanted me erased, and they were willing to fabricate evidence to do it. What they didn't know was that they had just handed me the rope I'd use to hang them. Before I continue my story, where are you watching from? Hit that like and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this unfolds. I sat across the table while Blake Rogers, the company's compliance officer, slid a thick folder toward me with a smirk that barely hid his eagerness. "Anonymous report says you leaked client data," he said, his voice carrying that fake professionalism that masks something personal. I opened the folder. The evidence looked airtight, server logs stamped with my username, access times that lined up perfectly with restricted files, even a personal email supposedly from me offering confidential information to an outsider. It was perfect. Too perfect. I had worked in compliance long enough to know when a trail had been manufactured, and this one was polished like glass. My pulse didn't spike. My face didn't twitch. Years in this office had trained me not to show my hand, especially when the walls closed in. Instead, I looked at Blake, his eyes flicking back and forth like he couldn't wait for me to explode. I didn't. That would have given him exactly what he wanted. Instead, I asked a single question, steady as a scalpel. "Who reviewed this before bringing it to me?" He paused. "It went through internal channels." He meant himself. He wanted me to fold, to panic, to sign whatever document HR would put in front of me once this charade was complete. Across the table, the head of HR shifted in her chair, clearly uncomfortable with the tension but too timid to challenge the man who claimed to be presenting facts. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice level. I'll need time to prepare my response. They expected begging, tears, maybe anger. What they got was a request that sounded almost procedural. Blake raised an eyebrow like he thought he'd won. Of course. Take until tomorrow to respond. I closed the folder and slid it back to him with calm precision. The move wasn't submission. It was strategy. Because the moment I saw that fake evidence, I knew two things. First, someone inside this building wanted me out, and second, if I handled this correctly, they were about to give me every tool I needed to end their career, instead of mine. This wasn't just a fight for my reputation. It was the opening move in a war they didn't even realize they had started. The moment I walked out of that conference room, I knew defending myself head-on would be a waste of breath. Blake had stacked the evidence too neatly, each piece designed to funnel suspicion in only one direction: mine. People who manufacture guilt make the same mistake. They build their case too perfect, too clean, forgetting that real life always leaves a little mess. I didn't storm into offices or make phone calls begging for understanding. Instead, I went back to my desk, opened the laptop, and started digging the way I'd been trained to do for over a decade. The system logs don't lie, not if you know where to look. I pulled archived reports, the kind most people don't bother checking because they're buried 3 folders deep in compliance backups. There, patterns started emerging, login times that didn't match my schedule, access requests approved seconds apart in ways no human could type, and subtle IP shifts that pointed to rerouting software. This wasn't just sloppy, it was intentional. Whoever set this up thought no one would look past the surface, but that's what I do. I look deeper. The more I traced, the more one name kept bubbling up from the digital noise. Blake Rogers. He hadn't even covered his own tracks well enough. He was using an administrative passcode recycled from an old project, one he assumed no one remembered. I remembered. And when I matched it to the supposed leak, the fingerprints were all over it. But exposing him too soon would be reckless. If I marched into HR with what I'd found, they'd circle the wagons, claim it was circumstantial or worse, accuse me of tampering with records. No, I needed something undeniable, something that would use the company's own procedures to turn his trap back on him. So I started sketching out a plan in my notebook. I wouldn't just prove I was innocent. I would let Blake incriminate himself so thoroughly that when the moment came, the company would have no choice but to believe me. Not because they liked me, not because I demanded it, but because the system they trusted would show them the truth in black and white. I closed the logs, cleared my desk, and locked the thought in my mind. If Blake wanted me erased, I would make sure he erased himself instead. I knew better than to go after Blake directly. People like him thrived on confrontation. It gave them cover to twist words and spin narratives. What he wouldn't expect was silence. Silence unnerves ambitious men more than shouting ever could. So instead of challenging him, I made him comfortable, let him think he'd already won. I started small. A nod in meetings when he talked over me, as if I agreed with his half-baked innovations. A carefully timed smile when he tried to assert authority in front of others. I fed his ego, and he swallowed it whole. When people believe you're beneath them, they stop watching you. That's when you can really move. My plan needed bait, something irresistible enough to make him slip up. I crafted a flash drive, not loaded with secrets, but with a single innocuous-looking file labeled Client Settlement Terms. I made sure the file title sounded juicy but vague, the kind of thing a power-hungry compliance officer couldn't resist peeking into. On the surface, it looked like a simple PDF. Underneath, I embedded a digital trigger tied directly to our internal monitoring system, a legitimate audit tool our company had installed years ago but rarely used. The moment that file was accessed, the system would quietly log the activity and escalate it straight to the board's private security team. No alarms, no warnings, just a silent flag that would keep stacking evidence until someone in authority couldn't ignore it anymore. I didn't leave the flash drive on his desk. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I forgot it in the break room, right next to the coffee machine, casually tucked under a stapled set of training notes I'd been reviewing. I even muttered to a coworker that I needed to reprint a file later, making sure the flash drive seemed like a careless accident. Within hours, it was gone. I didn't need to guess who took it. Blake had a pattern of prowling after hours, poking around where he shouldn't. And true to form, the first access notification hit my shadowed log just before midnight. Blake couldn't resist. He thought he'd stolen something valuable, something that could strengthen his fabricated case against me. What he didn't realize was that every keystroke was now painting him into a corner. The beauty of the trap was its simplicity. I wasn't fabricating anything. I wasn't hacking. I wasn't playing dirty. I was just letting the company's own tools do their job, tools Blake had forgotten existed. And once he opened that file, every second he spent with it tightened the noose around his neck. The next morning, I walked into the office as calm as if nothing had happened. Blake smirked in the hallway, clearly expecting me to be unraveling under the weight of his accusations. Instead, I just nodded and kept walking. Because the truth was already moving beneath him, quiet and relentless, like a fuse he'd lit with his own hands. The best part of a trap isn't when it snaps shut. It's the waiting. For the next 3 weeks, I watched Blake unravel piece by piece, each day stripping away the confident mask he wore. At first, he strutted through the office like he was untouchable, tossing smug glances my way, whispering to HR about progress on the investigation. But the system had already flagged him, and the weight of invisible scrutiny started to show. His voice grew sharper in meetings, his polished answers turned into stumbling explanations, and the same coworkers who once laughed at his jokes now avoided his eye. He stayed late most nights, huddled in his office with the blinds drawn, scrolling furiously, probably checking whether his planted evidence was holding up. Every time he thought no one was watching, I caught him fidgeting, rubbing his temples, snapping at assistants who brought the wrong report. He was a man waiting for a blow he couldn't see, and I gave him no sign that I was behind it. No confrontations, no hints, just silence. Because silence is more powerful than threats. It let him believe maybe he'd made a mistake. Maybe he'd left a door cracked open somewhere. And that doubt gnawed at him more viciously than any accusation ever could. I'd walk past his office, coffee in hand, and see him hunched over his desk like a man trying to plug leaks in a sinking ship. He didn't know the flood was already inside. He was already drowning, and all I had to do was watch. The summons came early on a Thursday morning, subject line, Emergency Audit Review, mandatory attendance. I knew what it meant before I opened it. The silent alerts tied to my bait file had been stacking for weeks, and the security team had finally decided it was time to surface what they found. When I stepped into the conference room, the air was already tight with unease. The board's private security officer sat at the head of the table with a laptop. HR looked pale and stiff, and Blake sat 2 seats away from me, his tie knotted too tight, sweat already prickling at his temples. He didn't look like a man in control anymore. He looked like someone waiting for a verdict. The officer began without preamble. We've been conducting a discrete audit based on recent anomalies in data access. Multiple flagged activities originate from administrative credentials tied to Mr. Blake Rogers. He tapped a key, and the projector lit up the wall with logs, timestamps, and screen captures. These include unauthorized access to compliance archives, manipulation of metadata, and attempts to frame another employee. My name glowed across several lines of falsified evidence. Only this time, next to each entry was another line, marked Authentication Error, Trace Redirected. Blake's color drained as the officer kept going. Additionally, a device registered to Mr. Rogers accessed a restricted file labeled Client Settlement Terms. That file was a monitored control document, and its access triggered a full security review. Here are the logs. Another tap, and there it was. Blake's digital fingerprint on every line, his credentials, his workstation ID, his late-night attempts to cover his trail. The silence in the room was absolute. HR stared at the screen like it was a firing squad. Blake stammered, It's a mistake. Someone spoofed my login." His voice cracked, the first break in his armor. I let him flail for a moment, then leaned forward just enough for my words to carry. "Check the audit logs," I said, calm and cold. No anger, no triumph. Just a simple statement that twisted the knife. The officer nodded and clicked again. Already verified. Each action required multi-factor authentication. No spoofing occurred. Every access was deliberate. The final nail. Blake's chair scraped against the floor as he half rose, muttering protests about conspiracy and sabotage, but no one in the room looked at him anymore. The board members exchanged glances, and the head of HR folded her hands like a judge preparing a sentence. "Blake Rogers, you are suspended effective immediately pending termination procedures. Security will escort you out." He froze, then sank back into his seat, defeated, sweat streaking down his forehead. No one spoke up for him. No one even pretended to. As he was led out, his eyes darted to me, desperate, searching for some sign of mercy. I gave him none. My silence was my answer. The meeting ended. Quickly after that, HR promised a formal statement to staff. The board assured structural safeguards would be implemented, and the security officer closed his laptop with the finality of a gavel. As I gathered my notebook, I felt the weight of every eye in the room shift toward me, not with suspicion anymore, but with a wary respect. They had seen the truth written in their own system's code, and they understood exactly who had forced it to the surface. The day after Blake was escorted out, I was called back into the same conference room. Only this time the tone was different. HR spoke first, her voice syrupy with regret. "Aaron, we owe you an apology. The evidence against you was false, and the company deeply regrets the position you were put in." Across the table, a board member cleared his throat and added what HR couldn't. "Your composure and professionalism throughout this process saved us from a far greater liability. We'd like to reinstate you immediately, with a raise, of course, and issue a public statement clearing your name." It was almost comical, hearing the same people who had sat silent during Blake's accusations now tripping over themselves to rewrite history. They wanted me back in the same role, smiling politely, grateful for scraps of dignity restored. But I hadn't endured weeks of slander, hadn't laid a trap so precise it left a man in ruins, just to slide quietly back into the same chair. I leaned forward, folded my hands, and spoke evenly. "I appreciate the offer, but reinstatement isn't enough." A flicker of panic crossed their faces, as if I might demand a lawsuit or resign on the spot. Instead, I let the silence linger, savoring the shift in power. "I don't want my old position," I continued. "I want his." For the first time, they understood this wasn't about vindication alone. It was about redirection, and I was already steering the outcome. The following Monday, I walked into the office not as the woman accused, not as the scapegoat they'd tried to bury, but as the new compliance officer. Blake's old nameplate was already gone from the corner office, replaced with mine in bold black letters, Aaron Walker. Some employees stared as I passed. Others avoided eye contact, whispering under their breath as if I had become untouchable overnight. I didn't acknowledge them. Respect earned through fear of exposure wasn't respect I needed to claim aloud. It simply hung in the air, undeniable. The office itself was bigger than anything I'd had before, windows stretching across the Chicago skyline. I placed my notebook on the polished desk, aligning it with the grain of the wood, then adjusted the blinds so the light hit just right. Order, control, clarity. Things Blake never understood. HR delivered the final paperwork in a neat folder, hands trembling as they slid it across. Full authority over compliance operations, direct reporting to the board, salary doubled, discretionary oversight written into my contract, no committee approval, no middle management interference. I signed without ceremony, no smile, no gloating, just ink on paper. That afternoon, I held my first team meeting. I kept it short. "Compliance isn't a burden," I told them. "It's the foundation. If you cut corners, the building collapses. If you fabricate, the system will expose you. This office won't be a shield for incompetence ever again." No one argued. No one dared. Later, walking past HR's glass wall, I caught the director's eye, the same one who'd sat quiet while Blake accused me. She looked down quickly, guilt flickering across her face. I didn't stop. Let her sit with it. Some lessons don't need to be spoken. I returned to my office, closed the door, and stood for a moment in the stillness. The skyline buzzed below with the hum of a city that never cared who was right or wrong inside one corporate tower. But here, in this office, the shift was permanent. The knife that had once been aimed at me was gone, and I had made certain it could never be lifted again. Revenge hadn't come from rage or spectacle. It came from patience, calculation, and using the system against the very person who thought he could weaponize it. Sometimes, victory isn't leaving in triumph. Sometimes it's staying, settling into the seat they tried to steal, and making sure everyone remembers exactly why you belong there. Sometimes the sharpest blade isn't the one you swing, it's the silence you hold until the enemy cuts themselves with their own arrogance. I learned that revenge doesn't always require fire, chaos, or grand spectacle. Sometimes the deadliest strike is letting them believe they've won until the evidence proves otherwise. Looking back on what happened with Blake Rogers, the real lesson isn't just about exposing a corrupt coworker. It's about patience, composure, and clarity in moments when the easy choice would be to explode in anger. When someone comes after you, fabricates lies, undermines your credibility, or tries to erase your contributions, the instinct is to fight back immediately. But emotion rarely wins in environments built on policy and perception. By holding still, digging deeper, and letting the system they trusted become the weapon of truth, I turned their own rules into my shield and my sword. The American workplace often rewards volume over value. Loud voices, flashy presentations, and aggressive personalities can drown out those who do the real work. But if you know your craft, document your steps, and understand the structure you're working within, you have leverage others overlook. That leverage isn't about destroying people. It's about ensuring fairness, protecting your integrity, and sometimes, yes, redirecting betrayal back to the one who started it. Blake wasn't ruined by me. He was ruined by his own shortcuts. All I did was let the light in. The final moral lesson is clear. Calculated restraint beats raw emotion. When you're wronged, don't rush to react. Gather information, understand the system, and position yourself so that when the truth surfaces, it does so in a way no one can deny. Revenge, at its best, isn't about crushing the other person completely. It's about balance, about showing that actions have consequences and integrity has power. How to get started today. Document everything. Keep a quiet record of your work, your ideas, and your interactions. Stay composed. Don't let anger write your story. Let clarity lead you. Learn the rules of your workplace. Often the policies ignored by others can become your strongest defense. Play the long game. Real strength is in patience, not reaction. If you've ever faced betrayal or false accusations at work, I want to hear your story. Comment below, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that prove silence, patience, and intelligence are the sharpest tools of all.